if someone looks on the outside and sees Robin Williams, they see the smile, they see him in Good Will Hunting and Mrs. Doubtfire, and you just see the pure joy in his face, but they might not know what that person is going through. Did you know how bad he was struggling?
Well, I think relative to his struggle was very much the struggle of a lot of comics and entertainers, right? This is what many folks in the entertainment industry deal with.
Yeah.
And can't talk about.
Right.
So yes, he experienced depression, anxiety over the course of his life, trauma, things like that. But, he had effective ways to manage it. And he got a lot of joy and healing from going out, entertaining audiences,
Right.
from being on set.
Yeah.
The irony of it all is the finished product is not something that, yes, he was proud of his work, but it's not something that he would watch or derive joy from. It was really about being immersed in environments where there's lots of folks who want to engage with what he has to say. In terms of his mental health, again, he had effective ways of managing it. And when I learned more and more about the challenges that entertainers deal with,
Right.
they have to put on a smile. Now in this day and age, there's a risk of getting canceled, going out and sharing things that might be unpopular subjects or might not be the right considered thing to say in a certain community. And granted, there are inappropriate things to say, but what I found in talking to comics and the like is that that's a very real fear.
Yeah.
And it leads to, I'd say a level of insecurity and frustration that I hadn't seen prior, prior to a few years ago.
What about your father's legacy and his role in your life inspires you today and keeps you, you're one of the biggest mental health advocates out there. You started a company because you want to help others. How does your father inspire you to do that?
I think for me, it's really about a continuation of our family's work. In his case, he very much lived to entertain, to help people laugh, to help people learn. And, that wasn't what I set out to do. For me, I'm very much focused on a healing journey.
Yeah.
And the discovery around that healing journey is that service is key. I need to be of service to others to support myself. But in order to be of service, you really need to take care of yourself.
Right.
So, there's a legacy of giving back that I think is kind of part of our family's DNA.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever set out to do things to help others. I think really what it came down to is when it came to looking at the collective human condition, folks suffering, folks in need, folks seeking connection, and evaluating our time here on this planet, it's very clear to me that we all have an opportunity to help people find love for themselves, find meaningful connection. And there's no feeling like that in the world.
No, when you can look at yourself in the mirror and have that self-love and realize that things are going to be okay. And for me, I tell people two things when it comes to mental health. One, do something, call your friend, call your mom, call your therapist, just please do something. And then number two would be feelings are temporary. You might feel sad, depressed in this moment, and it might seem like it might not end, but I promise you, I've lived through it. You've lived through it. Like, things can be okay. You can get better. I feel like maybe you've discovered a new purpose in life. Like, when you have the feeling to give back, like, it feels like over the last few years, you created PIM, Actually, I want to give you, obviously a platform to talk about that, but you have this new purpose to help each other or to help others that are struggling with their mental health. Where did that sense and urge come from, you think?
It came from taking an introspective look at how I was taking care of myself and the people I cared about.
Yeah.
Not to say I'm necessarily a caretaker.
Yeah.
We all assume that role at times, but I started looking at my relationship with things like stigma.
Yeah.
The culture and the families I'm a part of, historically, how things like mental health were brought up, and then even looking at, my perception of that history.
Yeah.
Right. For me, growing up, you hear the word mental health, and it's like that's an institutional thing.
Yeah.
We grew up understanding, or in my generation, I think younger generations might not have the same type of perception, but in my generation, it's kind of tail end of the institutionalization culture, which kind of started petering out for a number of reasons due to federal policy and so forth, but in the 80s, late 70s actually, but so that was a whole thing. Yeah. The cultural zeitgeist around it was there were asylums. Yep. And that's kind of the apex of crisis culture. Yep. And so, but then what happened was you have you have a series of time where deinstitutionalization occurs, and then suddenly it's on folks are on our streets in crisis, and we're looking at things like different drug epidemics. Yep. And suddenly crisis starts permeating our daily experience. Yeah. And then we're starting to tell ourselves, okay, well, mental health is starting to become a thing that we're seeing on the streets. There's people in dysregulation, potentially with serious mental illness, who need navigation or care. And I think our collective perspective is evolving over time as we're starting to understand, hey, it's not just about folks on the street, folks in our family or who are experiencing potentially serious mental illness or crisis. It's actually about our experience with anxiety and depression. And I think it's taken us some time, as you mentioned, only about 3 to 5 years ago as this really started
kind of shifting,
blossoming into our collective perception. Yeah. I mean, it had before, but there were some historical things that contributed to it. Sure. The pandemic, things like the opioid epidemic and other drug epidemics. But I think on top of that, there's some underlying factors that are really contributing to stress overload and more manifestation of mental health conditions cropping up. I think there's an overcrowding that's occurring, and that's not necessarily a physical overcrowding. We've had dense urban environments for millennia. I really think it's actually a digital overcrowding. Yeah. The way in which the mobile first generation interacts with things like social media, work. Yeah. It's very disjointed and very dense in terms of interactions, not necessarily quality or negative interactions. It's just a jumble. And it's a jumble happening at a very high velocity. Yeah. And it's very challenging for folks.
I love everything that you just said. I'm trying to go back to a point that stuck with me, which is you saying that you had to take care of yourself, or you realized you weren't taking care of yourself, and that's when you struggled the most. And that's kind of where that spark of wanting to help people with their mental health came from. You've been sober 6 years now. Your father passed just about 10 years ago. After his suicide, is that when you struggled the most with
Alcohol
taking
abuse and
that and taking care of yourself, or?
No, I think there was a few times in my life where I struggled an equal amount, or similar. That was probably actually, yes, it was the time of my life where I struggled the most, but there were similar times in my life. Post September 11th actually was a very challenging time for me. I moved to New York in September of 2001. I wasn't able to acknowledge the trauma of living in New York, in a post 9/11 New York, for a number of years, because I didn't believe that I could acknowledge that I was negatively impacted by that experience, the attacks and the New York after that, because I didn't know folks who passed in the towers. And you know, I think there's many folks I've spoken with who feel a similar way, you know, in the sense that, you know, there's a shooting or there's some sort of political event or that is really devastating to us. And yet it's hard to acknowledge, hey, this is really impacting me in specific ways. And I think we need to give ourselves a break and acknowledge the fact that it's like, hey, this shit's hard. And so, you know, for me, we all have kind of primary operating procedures, and alcohol was a primary part of that for a long time. Because it was my way of coping.